So this is actually not my first video of 2021, but it's my first sit down chat sort of video, because my first video of 2021, if you haven't seen that yet, was my surgery vlog. That explains this. So if you want to know why my thumb is in a cast right now, then I would recommend that you go and watch my surgery vlog. I will be making a video at some point to update you on what's going on with my recovery from my operation, so stay tuned for that. So today I am actually not going to be talking about this. I'm going to be talking about Raynauds disease. I think I've mentioned it in 2 of my videos before, so I'll leave them in the description in case you want to see them. Raynauds disease is basically when usually the extremities, like your fingers and toes, it goes a purpley sort of blue colour or maybe even yellow or white, because it means that they're actually very sensitive to the cold. So when it's really cold, your blood vessels will constrict and let less blood go to the extremities, and that is why they go funny colours. And then when it's really hot, the blood vessels will widen and let a lot of blood go to them, which is why they go really, really red once you start to try and warm them up. I was diagnosed with Raynauds disease about a year ago, and since then I've had different tests to try and determine whether I had primary or secondary Raynauds, which I'll tell you about in a minute. And in this past year, I've had to learn how to live with it basically, and learn how to cope, know my triggers and everything like that. So I thought today I would talk to you about what it's like living with Raynauds disease, what type I have, and give you some tips from my experience. So as I said, I've mentioned this in a video before. I think the one where I talked about it the most was having problems with my ABS, and I sort of explained what Raynauds actually is in that video, and kind of talked about how I got diagnosed with it basically, because it's a bit of a long story, so I'm not going to say all that again in this video. But basically there are 2 types of Raynauds, and there's primary and secondary. Primary is the less serious, it's more common, and secondary is slightly more serious because it usually means that it's an underlying condition that is causing it. And if you have secondary Raynauds, it can get quite serious. So recently I had tests to determine whether I had primary or secondary, and thankfully those tests came back negative, meaning I don't have any underlying conditions causing it, which does mean that the Raynauds I have is primary. It mainly affects me in the winter, and that is probably the case for most people because obviously it's a lot colder, and I don't remember that many flare-ups with it in summer at all. And as well as the cold weather being a trigger for me, I have ABS, which I'm sure you probably know from most of my videos. I have it on my left hand and my right foot, and that basically means that my fingers are already quite misshaped, and the blood flow isn't very good in these fingers and toes anyway. So that's why it's a lot worse for this hand and for this foot, but there isn't actually another underlying condition that is causing me to have my constricting blood vessels. Stress is also apparently a trigger, and I have noticed this actually, but not as much as the cold weather. So it doesn't really affect me too much because it's just a colour change in my fingers and toes, and sometimes it can be a bit tingly and sometimes painful, but not very often. It's usually just the colour change, so it doesn't really have that much of an effect on my life. I guess the only thing is I have to be quite careful when it comes to being in the cold weather and try and avoid it if I can, and just prevent it really. But it is something that I think I'm going to find easy to live with, considering that I have other conditions that I have to live with that are much more harder to live with than Raynauds. So now I've told you about how Raynauds affects me, I'm going to tell you some tips about how I deal with it. Tip number 1 is to know your triggers. So as I said, mine is cold weather, which is the case for most people really, and also stress, so try and avoid stress, which is very hard, but it's something that you got to try and do. And also, as I said, me just having ABS is sort of a trigger in itself, but that's not something I can really avoid. Tip number 2 is to avoid certain medications. I think the main ones that you're supposed to avoid with Raynauds are a type called beta blockers, I think that's what they're called, and they are medications that people usually get put on if they need help with their heart or something like that. I actually got put on some for migraines, so it's to do with the blood vessels, I guess, but I had to come off them because it wasn't doing my Raynauds any good. It was actually making it quite a lot worse. Tip number 3 is thermals. make sure you have lots and lots of these. These are some really, really thick thermal socks. I also have thermal gloves, and they are so important because it's a really good way of preventing your extremities from getting too cold when you have to obviously go outside, because you can't avoid being in cold weather. Tip number 4 is to try and keep the house warm. Sometimes, even being inside, my hands and feet can go like purple. In fact, I say sometimes, a lot of the time they can. And that is just if the radiators aren't on enough, you know? If my room is warm enough, then I should be fine. But even though I'm not outside, just the cold house is enough to get them going, get them blue. And my final tip for you, tip number 5, is actually hand and foot warmers. Now, I have heard that it is not good to put direct heat onto them, but sometimes you do just need a bit of like a quick relief because they are so cold. And when I come in from outside sometimes, even if I have been wearing thermal gloves and thermal socks, sometimes that isn't enough. And when I get in, I like to warm them up with some hand warmers. I've got some really good ones that you just like, you can reuse them and you pop this thing inside and they warm up super fast, and I just hold them in my hands. And I have some that you can put in your shoes with your feet, which are really good. And for Christmas, I actually got something that is quite possibly one of my favourite presents. This is something that I have been using to prevent my feet from getting too cold whilst I'm like in the house. This actually really helps to stop them going blue whilst I'm just sat at my desk working or doing whatever else. And it is this really cool foot warmer. So you basically just plug it in, and it has this like little settings thing on it, and they can go up to 3 different settings. And yeah, I just think that it is actually really cool. At first, when I opened this on Christmas Day, I was a bit like, okay, strange sort of present, but it has been a lifesaver. It is so good, and it feels so nice when you put your feet in this. It is like lined all the way inside with fluffiness, and it is just so nice. So I definitely recommend investing in one of those. So that is actually all I have for you today. I hope you found it helpful somewhat, and I hope you enjoyed watching it. Thank you so much for watching. Bye!